We're good.
We are ready.
All right, everybody. Good morning and welcome to the May 8th Lawrence Douglas County Planning Commission mid-month meeting. It's a meeting where we, the commissioners, get to talk to staff and each other. It's a public meeting. We invite the public to watch, but we do not take any questions. And I'm going to turn it over to Becky to talk about what we're going to discuss today.
Thank you. All right, I'll be helping to facilitate the Zoom video portion of the meeting, and I'll work alongside the vice chair to facilitate these proceedings. I am just going to go over a few quick housekeeping items for this hybrid meeting. This meeting is being recorded and broadcast on the city's YouTube channel and cable channel 25. Please remember to mute yourself during the meeting when you're not speaking. The chat function for this public meeting is disabled, and all chats will go directly to me. Unless you are participating during the meeting, please turn your video off, and this allows active meeting participants to be seen on screen. You will still be able to hear the meeting, and when you are participating, please turn your video on. If you have any trouble, you can send a chat to me. The city reserves the right to mute people or turn individual videos off to minimize distractions during the meeting, and with that, I'll turn it back over to the vice chair.
Thank you. And I think today we're going to get an update from Elizabeth on the Land Development Code. So Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Good morning and thank you. I am going to pull my slideshow up here. Hang on one second. So before I jump into this, I want to ask the group, we have this time this morning to talk about the code. We finished with steering committee the review of module 3, which is administration and procedures, and I have a full presentation. You've seen some of it for the full code. Some of it's been updated just to make information more clear. Would you like to start with module 3 first and then go backwards, or should we go top to bottom in the draft?
Well, that's a good question.
I'll say top to bottom, start and go.
May I ask, Elizabeth, is there, given time constraints, if we go top to bottom, is there a chance we won't finish module 3 if we go top to bottom?
I think it depends on how much you guys want to take up some of the topics today, knowing that we're kind of rounding the corner on adoption. I could do a hybrid. We could do a brief overview of module 3 to start with, and then back up to the top, and you guys will know what's in module 3. So if you want to connect the questions between how do I get this approved or what does this change mean, we can do it that way.
Sounds good.
Great.
Sounds good.
Okay. All right. So hold on. Let me skip ahead some slides here. Okay, so the procedural slides, I skipped ahead on one and not the other, are kind of visually dense, and I apologize for that. It's a throwback to my lawyer days when there were too many words on the slide, but there aren't actually a ton of big changes in the procedure section. So let me share screen, and you can see how impressive I am with the number of words I can get on the slide.
That is impressive.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I only want to do my best for you guys. Okay, so let's see if I can get some of this stuff to go away. Oops. I am still seeing the box at the top. Let's move that over. Nope. Okay, so what's changed in the administration and procedures? We have, in the front end section, put rules in for what happens for projects that are in process when the city is changing between codes. So when you go from the 2006 code to the 2024 code, there are specific rules for how far an application has got in the process, which code it needs to comply with. And the goal there is just to be fair to applicants and not pull the rug out from under them. There is an opportunity for anyone to use the new code if they want to, no matter where they are in the process, but everybody else has steps that they need to follow. Across multiple sections in the procedures, we deleted the language that the decision-making bodies are not required to approve the maximum density or intensity. Leaving it in or not leaving it in doesn't change your authority to make a recommendation or approval, but it does move away from a potential implicit statement about what the city thinks about density. So I don't think this will make a lot of change in your everyday activities as Planning Commission. We did a little cleanup in the administrative extension section. We simplified the process to extend the timeline. If a project has been delayed and they need extra time to get up and going with their approval and permit, they can get an administrative extension. We updated the review criteria for plan developments, for text amendments to the land development code, and for rezoning only for successive applications. So I get denied a rezoning and I want to come back. What is the criteria to determine if I can come back and what the city is looking at? So the reason we make changes in the review criteria is because we want to let applicants be clear about the city's project expectations. So review criteria tell you what the reviewing body should be looking at. So we want to make sure that those align with Plan 2040 and with where the city is going in the future. And then we added an administrative adjustment process. And this will allow staff, if needed, to make minor measurable adjustments to a project. Usually where this comes up is someone comes in and they say, hey, I need to go a foot into my setback because there's something going on my property, like there's a stream and I've done a setback from it. Can I move my development over 1 foot into the setback? And within the guidelines, staff can say yes to that. This section also includes clarity about the city's ability to offer Fair Housing Act accommodations and substantial burden adjustments under RLUIPA, the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. So it's kind of a 3-for-1 section there in places where you might need to scoot stuff around a little bit, not a ton. So let's see what else has been updated. The general review procedures for everyone in the group who are procedure nerds, you can look at one whole set of general procedures. And so this will tell an applicant or staff everything that we're going to go through, start to finish, for an application. This doesn't get used a lot of the time, but it's really important when you do need it. So it's clear about how you defer applications and what happens in terms of providing additional notice. It's clear about how you hold a neighborhood meeting, what happens if your application has been approved and then expired, and what can the city do in terms of someone who's violated a permit. Can you revoke that permit? So this full set is in there. A lot of this stuff was in the current code, just in bits and pieces. So we pulled it together and cleaned it up and filled it out. So we have a shared set of expectations for those procedures. In planned development, so you guys might remember when we were updating the districts and uses, we updated planned development to require one of 4 things. It has to be doing something above and beyond, and we've defined that now. So it's not just, hey, I want to do planned development and I've given you a beautiful site plan and I even drew trees on it. But it is, hey, I want to do planned development and I'm providing the city affordable housing, or I'm providing the city additional sustainability in this development. And so we updated the planned development procedures to align with that, to make sure that the city has an ability to read the site plan and make sure, or read the application and make sure it's doing the above and beyond thing that it's supposed to do. And we are also still working with staff to clean up the major minor amendment process, which is, it doesn't align with other stuff in the code, and we want major and minor to mean roughly the same thing in most places, so that an applicant or staff can look at it and say, okay, that's going to be a major or a minor, not linked to whether it's plan development or site plan or whatever. So we want to kind of bring that all into one place. So those are things. Okay, first slide was what's changed. So those are flat out changes. These are updates. So you've got something going on in the code here, but we've updated it, pulled it together, clarified it. A few more updates. We added and expanded the section for land development code interpretation to clarify that new uses for PUDs can be interpreted. So we start moving away from that locked in time aspect of PUDs. Clarified that new uses can be interpreted into the code and put a specific process in there for an applicant to request that interpretation. So in that case, when an applicant requests an interpretation, the interpretation goes to the director, and the director makes the decision. And I'm not like pointing at Jeff, I'm pointing at whoever sits in that seat over time. That makes it an administrative determination, and it is appealable to the Board of Zoning Adjustment. So I don't want anyone walking away thinking, oh, staff can go wild and interpret all kinds of new things into the code, which would mean Jeff could interpret an otter farm into the code, maybe. That would be fun for the family. But it is a full process. So that's in there. Then we've been working with staff who've taken this up as a project on their own over the last couple months to streamline how the site plan requirements lay out. So we now have standard and major site plans. So we've taken away minor or rolled it up into standard essentially. And the next step in the site plan clarification process that we're working with staff on is understanding if you come in with a standard site plan, do you have to comply with the other sections like the mobility section or the parking section or the design standards? To what extent do you have to comply with that? Easier if someone's coming in with a major, they have to comply with everything. But we need that middle ground standard place because we don't want to stop people from redeveloping or updating their properties. And sometimes we stop them by saying, you know, if you do more than 25 or 50% development on your site, you have to comply with all standards. That starts getting expensive. So we're trying to find that balance in there. So finally, what has stayed the same? And sometimes this is an important question for people. What has stayed the same? Why does this little thing keep popping up? Go away. All the major processes have stayed the same. So if it's something the city is doing now, the city is going to continue doing it. The reviewing and decision-making bodies have stayed the same. So Planning Commission's role remains the same. City Commission's role remains the same. BZA still gets to see its stuff, and the director and staff are decision makers on their things. The rezoning review criteria, remember a little earlier I said that was just for resubmission. The basic rezoning review criteria, still the golden criteria. Subdivision procedures have remained the same. Non-conformities have the same effect. We did add a short section for non-conforming site features. And so that is like your parking or your landscaping. So sometimes somebody wants to pull out the parking lot and move it someplace else. If it was non-conforming, we want to make sure that non-conformity gets cleaned up as changes are made. And then violations and enforcement stay the same. The city always has the range of violation and enforcement options that it has under home rule or state statute.
Elizabeth, if I could
Yeah.
interrupt for just a second on number 3, rezoning review criteria. So I was reading through module 3. I noticed on the review criteria for rezoning, something that I didn't recognize was requirement for a retail impact study. Was that intended
Yes.
for Planning Commission or only for the decision-making body?
I will ask Becky and Jeff to answer that one. We kept it in there, but I understand it doesn't get used very often.
It's typically something that you would get as part of the review for the Planning Commission. So it's part of the review staff does with the staff report typically.
I
But
didn't get to see one.
it,
And the introduction of that, to me, seems like it takes us away from land use into policy.
it does, and that was a city commission discretion on that one to add. So you can always add to Golden. You just can't kind of take away.
To the steering committee then probably,
It could.
question about it being there.
It could be. It's very rarely trips because we don't get a lot of projects anymore that trip 100,000 square feet, which is the threshold for requiring the studies. I think maybe 2 or 3 times in the last 5 years I can think of when it was triggered.
I just don't see, I mean, just me, I don't see how that qualifies as land use. That is it's a policy decision. Am I wrong on that?
I would argue that oversaturation of the retail space could lead to vacancies that do
Yeah.
in fact.
Oh, absolutely. I don't doubt the importance
Yeah.
of
No,
that
I'm saying,
information.
I think it has land use implications, even if it's not explicitly a land use question.
Yeah.
I agree with you. I think it's clearly a land use decision.
So getting at how that is presented, what we would make a determination on, that's going to be super, if we're going to bring that to the Planning Commission, that's going to need to be super clear on what the bar is. It needs to be almost math. Otherwise, it's going to be an opinion on how much retail we want to have in town, and I just don't see how that's a factor in, is this area good for retail zoning?
Sure.
There's a lot of math that goes into that calculation that staff does produce, and we do try to work on getting every other year a retail market survey completed for the community, and we'll admit we've had some issues with the last couple runs of it. The state has changed how they report sales tax. The other one would have been right in the middle of COVID, which clearly was almost impossible to do. So we're trying to figure out how to revise that to make that even work in the modern age, because when it was first done in 2006, the state reported a sales tax a very, very certain way, and now they don't do it at all that way. So we're having to evolve that as everything around it has changed. It's a very math-heavy thing. To be honest with you, it's probably when you see one of those come in the staff report, it's probably one of the most intensive parts of the staff report because of how much math and research has to go in behind the scenes on it. But it is an addition that the community has asked been added in there since about 2006.
In the end, though, it's going to end up being a subjective call, and it'll be what type of retail and,
Well, I think everything at some level ends up being a subjective call, but we have the same thing with housing, for example. We have the housing index.
I've got another question on that too. But I don't, I've got that concern that it's an explicit, because it was you're going to do this and that. It's part of review criteria. And if it's in the review criteria, you will at least consider these things and this, then I have a concern about that being a change from what we have typically considered when we have rezoning in front of us. So I want to ask that question of the steering committee, just to make sure that they do intend that to be there.
And but this only gets triggered if it's 100,000 square feet.
Under current code, yes.
Current code. So
And
that would continue in the new code as well.
correct. I would anticipate that. And the key is that
It's a pretty high bar. I mean,
it's a pretty high bar, and it's also a very specific bar because you have to meet certain what's called NAICS codes requirements. If the project doesn't include a certain level of that code, then that doesn't total into the 100,000 square feet. So if you have 50% in, 50% out, but it's 100,000 in total, that doesn't trigger the retail market. It would have to be 100,000.
that's the math.
Yeah, and that has to be in there. So there has to be an assumption by the applicant that there is a certain level of that or a certain intent of that. And of course, as we all know, we can't really sometimes predict how those things shake out sometimes in the real world.
Okay.
I think, just to give you guys a little history on that, so I think, Jeff, did you say it was 2006 or 2008?
I think it was around.
Came in?
I think it was 2006. If my slightly
Yeah.
not caffeinated brain's working.
Gotcha. So that is definitely of its time. We started seeing that sort of requirement in codes in the late 90s, early 2000s, and at baseline, the idea was to ask the applicant to show that they were going to put in a shopping center that could support itself fiscally, financially, right? So it was that, what are you bringing to the table, and how do we know it's going to stand up? My other guess is in Lawrence, just after all of the hullabaloo about the Riverfront Mall and Mass Street, that this would be a not unreasonable request to understand the impact of development of this size. So I don't have a straight up answer for you, and we'll take it back to steering committee. It's not unknown, but it's also not as common now as it might have been in that time.
I think it's a critical question. My only question is, does it belong in recommend or in decision? Planning commission or city commission? That's all I'm asking, where it belongs.
Thanks for clarifying that. Gotcha, okay. Decision, how come I can't spell this morning?
Thanks for
Okay.
letting me click into that.
Absolutely. Okay, so last slide, where we are right now. So post steering committee, we had steering committee meeting a couple weeks ago. We walked away from that with instructions for consultant team to revise the SUP section, the special use permit section, to confirm that the special use permit approval is for the use, and there can be conditions on the use. There can be conditions on the site depending on what's going through, but for the most part, the remainder of the application is going to go through site plan review. There's a distinction there that can be important. If someone wants to make changes to the site unrelated to the use, they don't necessarily need to go back through the full SUP process. So that's why we want to make that clarification. But there's kind of a bubble around everything that City Commission approved that is not changeable without going back to City Commission. And then steering committee is recommending that we eliminate conditional zoning. And actually consultant team pushed for this, so I'm not going to make it sound like the steering committee brought it up and stabbed it. Consultant team recommended getting rid of conditional zoning along the lines of every time we go outside of the code and make a lot of new rules for a site or limit the uses that are allowed on that site, and we kind of make that an ongoing thing, we are essentially editing the code. And so for the city's benefit and for the next applicant's benefit, the better practice for when we're in the place of, hey, we're doing conditional zoning and we're bringing this down to one use is allowed on the property, amend the code is the better way to go. Keep it a living document, make sure that it reflects, hey, this decision is so important that we want it to be in the use table. And so we think what works with that, what pairs with that is the emphasis and effort that we've all put into updating the use table. And it may be that after this meeting, you guys want to go back and double check the use table and think about, hey, where have we thought, we're going to do some conditional rezoning? And does the use table reflect what actually should happen there? And so we move away from conditional, we stick with standard, and we have the zoning districts and the uses aligning with each other.
So
Do those two changes make sense? Go ahead.
well, yeah, so on that, what I'd understood, over the time when we've had these things, conditional uses where we've eliminated all but one use, we've done that because it's a reflection of our current code not being adequate to support the things that might be coming at it. That goes all the way back to, 2006, and then before that, whatever it was. If that's the case, that provided a vehicle for people to do things that either we missed or hadn't contemplated or became new. Are we saying then that the only vehicle available to someone bringing something that we didn't think about in this room right here today is a text amendment to our code? And if so, is there,
Yeah, that's-
should we provide for something that we didn't think of today?
Good question. So part of that goes back to the earlier slide on interpreting the code. So one of the things that we've done in this version of the land development code is define the categories of uses. So what is a commercial use very generally? And what is an outdoor commercial use very generally? So that should allow things that we missed and new uses to be interpreted in to the code. So we wanted to create a standardized process for that. So I think to the question, what do we do in the case of new uses? Because we know there's something on the horizon that, someone probably, in Lawrence is thinking of at this very moment. How do we do that? Typically we say new uses come through the interpretation process also, which is why we try to be so robust with our category definitions over our use definitions, right? Because all the new uses should fit into a category somewhere. If we don't think that process is going to get us there for one reason or another, or if we think that's going to put too much pressure on staff, which, sometimes could be the case if someone comes in with a mini nuclear generator, then we may not want to have that interpreted in. We could, I think we say in the interpretation process that staff can send it up. So if we don't, and I'm sorry, I don't have the draft open in front of me, we can always say, staff has the discretion to send this through a more complete interpretation process, and the path to that is Planning Commission and City Commission. Or we could say, you do need to come in with a text amendment if we figure out that we really can't handle this because we want to do a full process and we want the community to be able to talk about your mini nuclear reactor. So I think what I'm saying is I understand what you're asking. My answer is let it go through interpretation or text amendment. However, if you guys feel that those aren't the correct avenues, then let's figure out what we want things to do, perhaps in a category of things with larger impacts.
Okay, thank you.
And if it did go through interpretation, is this the same interpretation where Jeff, it goes to Jeff and then the Board of Zoning? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, so if it goes to Jeff and BZA, and I think what we'd want to work with City Attorney's Office on is there a way we can do a workaround for new uses? Because, or we could decide, yeah, BZA can do that. That's cool. So that's a conversation to have. I'm sorry, I was defaulting to my position that BZA and Planning Commission have different paths, and that it may be that that's a great path for BZA. So we can think about that also.
Jeff, how much pressure does that put on you guys? And is that a problem in the past, or you see it as a problem in the future?
It's not been a problem necessarily in the past. I don't see it as being one in the future, quite truthfully, because what I think what will happen is if the interpretation is so substantial, we would actually recommend a text amendment. We'd bring it to you all to initiate and begin that process. My always concern is I want there to be equity in the process, and I want it to be a holistic review. I don't want an addition for one property with one property in mind. If we're going to make a table change, it needs to be with the whole city in mind and see what that looks like as in totality, not just in an instance. So I don't see it being a lot of pressure. It's probably just it's maybe a different way of how we go about things than what we've normally done with the code that we currently have.
I agree with the general notion of it and the general paths. It's just the elimination of that if we just didn't get it. I don't know. I've said it. I was concerned about that.
No, it's a good concern, because there's always something coming around the corner, and sometimes it's something coming around the corner with new technology.
Yeah.
I'm going to take this question, if you don't mind, and bring it back to steering committee, and I'm going to see if I can find
Thank you.
anyone with new codes out there who's gone down a different path with the thing we can't see yet.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I have one question about conditional zoning. I guess having been on the commission for almost 6 years, I should have a better memory. But when we've encountered it really rarely, right? But when we do approve, usually conditional zoning is some sort of compromise, right? Because the requested zoning is something that the commission opposes or doesn't recommend, and yet we agree to these conditions. So when that has happened, have we automatically initiated a text amendment, request?
Off of conditional zoning?
Yes.
No, not typically, because the conditional zoning usually resolves the issue before the commission.
For that particular.
For that particular, right.
I
And
wonder from a procedural standpoint if we could only approve conditional zoning in the case that we're initiating a text amendment request. Just a thought.
Well, then I would say, is what's the point of the conditional zoning? Because if you're going to initiate
Well,
the TA.
Point, forgive me, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, just thinking, I was going through the logic on that. If you go through the text amendment process, you get to a use that's ultimately allowed, but then the property is still hamstrung by the condition because it would have to be rezoned for the condition to be removed.
Right.
So you're burdening the applicant with 2 applications and 2 application fees.
Well, and my impression has been when we've encountered it, that the intention has been the opposite, to allow an applicant to move forward.
Right.
And yet, a conditional zoning situation is usually someone testing the limits of the code, right? They're bumping up against the limits of what the code has traditionally allowed. And would that not be a logical time to reevaluate that particular use in general for applicants that might follow under similar circumstances? So I think that's the potential utility.
Yeah. I can see the utility. I just.
I don't know, procedurally, maybe that's just complicating things, but I think if the point of conditional zoning is to minimally inconvenience an applicant and recognize that they've got a good idea, what is the most efficient way to do that? To deny the rezoning request and tell them, come back in 5 months when we've had a chance to discuss a text amendment. That, I don't know what is, and it is probably best for the steering committee to discuss, but it's just a possibility that I wanted to raise.
Yeah. I think that kind of just jumps to mind there is we would have a potential of having staff processing 2 applications at the same time, which would slow down other applications that would be bottlenecked behind them because we'd be doing 2 instead of 1. But I mean, I think that's a question for the Planning Commission and the steering committee on how you would like to run those through.
Sure.
Most of the codes that I've run into do not. If you're not in the use table, you go to a text amendment. That's the it's a very binary decision. Are you there? If not, go to a text amendment. And usually what staff will do is we'll advise people that may not work in this instance, but what they usually are finding is it is a use that's in the table. It's just not permitted in the district. So it's probably a question about, do we have the density and dimensional standards and the permissions in the use table set correctly so people have opportunities, or are they so narrowly defined that doesn't exist, and that's why conditional zoning is being utilized, is to be the Band-Aid for those narrow sets in Article 4 and Article 6.
I think it's a human response to not want to inconvenience someone who's standing in front of you, but it would return us to the principle that inconveniencing an applicant or not inconveniencing an applicant is not the commission's responsibility.
It's not a golden factor.
Exactly.
That's a good point.
Very much related to this is the question of the historic uses and adaptive reuses. And I think I've raised that with you, Elizabeth.
You have.
And I know I've raised it with planning commissioners and with staff. I hope that's something that the steering committee and you will address, because I think that's an important part of our zoning code, how we deal with historic structures. It's an important part of how we deal with Plan 2040.
Yes, and I had flagged that to come back up in the rest of the PowerPoint, so thanks for bringing it in.
HRC has been a part of the committee, but the points you called out and the example you called out was a good one.
Great. So should we swing back to the top of the presentation and just do some highlights to let you guys think of if it triggers any other questions you'd like to ask about procedures or content in the code?
Sounds good.
Okay. Doing okay on time here?
Yeah, we have till 9.
Good.
So, yeah.
Okay, great. So let's go back this way. Okay, so summary of updates. This is a slide that everyone has seen. More housing types are allowed in all residential districts. In a couple slides, we're going to talk about that in more detail again. Range of smaller residential development types added. More areas in the city will be zoned mixed use. Renewable energy systems are allowed by right and as an accessory use. bike transportation connections and parking is required. Minimum parking requirements have been eliminated and replaced with a parking maximum. Planned development projects require those specific, I still have public amenities in there. Let's not open up that unhappiness. Specific. Above and beyond. And there are stream buffer requirements. So I'm going to do a little more detail on some of these to see if it spurs any questions. So in our first module of drafting, we did zone districts and uses. So this is the types and structures and uses that are allowed where in the city. So you all may be getting questions, and one of the pieces of information we're going to be putting out over the next few weeks is what is not changing. Sometimes this is as relevant to people's questions as what is changing. So we want to point out that the zoning on individual properties isn't changing. This is not an effort to rezone. We're converting it. In some cases, people will have more development opportunities because in drafting this, the goal wasn't to kind of crank down on development, but it was to open up opportunities for more development. So wherever you were, you either stay there or you may get a little more. A little more could be in terms of square feet. It could be in terms of smaller lot sizes. We'll talk about that just in a slide here. But nobody is going to be rezoned from residential to commercial or commercial to residential. This is a conversion process. If you want to see, or if you're getting questions from people about what that looks like on their property, there is a conversion zoning map on the project website. And you can put your address in it, and it'll tell you where you were and where you're going. So if someone has specific questions about their property, you can send them back to the website. Also, single unit, single family development is still allowed. We have made changes that allow at least a duplex, if not more, units on a lot, but it doesn't take away single unit development. So sometimes when we start saying, oh, everyone can have duplexes, people jump to the conclusion of no one can have single family anymore. That's not the case. It can still be developed in the residential districts. Existing land uses, the things that are approved right now, on the whole, stay the same. If it was non-conforming, it will likely be non-conforming coming through, although we did make some effort to clean some of those up. And if it becomes non-conforming because of these code changes, which we also tried to minimize, that means it gets to stay in place. So what we hear, and what I'm sharing with you, what we hear as we go through code adoption, is people get really worried about their business or their property or their home. And what is this code? And everyone is trumpeting all these great changes that are going to take place. But what does it mean for me and my biggest investment? What it means for you and your biggest investment is these things will not be changing, or you may be getting a little bit more. So that's great on your property. Sometimes it's a little concerning to people about their neighbor's property because they will also assume that their neighbor will now be pulling down their house and building, something industrial. And so those are things that we try to work through with the rest of the code and the development standards. So then also the last one on here. So many of the currently identified land use types and associated standards have been the same and are coming forward. So for the bulk of the city, that is residential in particular, the code changes don't really have a day-to-day impact on their property. Questions about that before I move on? Okay, so what's changing in the residential districts? You may remember we introduced minimum lot area standards that are specific to residential use types. We added a range of housing, and the big change here is we introduced the minimum density requirements for new development to implement Plan 2040, right? So again, I'm going to just kind of hammer on this one, and I apologize to you guys, but this gets lost in most conversations. If I have a house on my property, I don't have to change anything to meet that density requirement. If I scrape my house or start rebuilding, I may need to meet the density requirement depending on the amount of change I'm making. So this is how it ties back into that, what has to meet the code and what only has to meet parts of the code conversation we had about site plan review. So this is the tricky part where the whole web starts coming together. So at a minimum, the change to minimum and maximum density looks like this. So you can see what the current districts are in the left side column, what the new district is. So we consolidated a lot of districts into one in multiple places here. And then the far right column are the minimum and maximum densities. And these are intended to align with Plan 2040. So this comes into the code from the work the city has already done. So you can see if you kind of look at the RSs, the RS 40, 20, 10, 7, and 5, the highest sort of maximum density you're going to get to in those development areas is 6 dwelling units to the acre. And I can't tell you off the top of my head what the lot size is there. Can someone do it faster than me? 560 divided by 6. That's a 7,000, roughly 7,000 square foot lot, right? So one of the other things that the consultant team sees as we're making changes like this is everyone assumes all of a sudden there are going to be houses everywhere, and there are going to be tiny houses everywhere. And so I want to back us up to some of the math in the code that talks about, what does this mean? So those 6 units to the acre is still a healthy sized lot. It's a 7,000 square foot lot. As we get into the RS3 and RS4, you can see the densities are going up, and that reflects the idea that we're really moving into more multifamily development. So multifamily development doesn't spread as far as single family development. So now we're going to see more building up to meet those densities rather than building out to meet those densities. Then at the bottom of the table here, going across, we do have the new R5 district, and that is a minimum of 33 dwelling units to the acre. There is development at this density in the city. And again, not everybody's going to be able to rezone to this, right? So this is going to be part of the conversation as we go through rezoning. The goal of the new districts and the how we look at them in relationship to the plan is to say you can't ask for just anything anywhere. You have to ask for a zoning district that is in context with the development that's going on there. So, some of the other questions we might get is, I'm in a single family, and I have a 2-acre lot, and is someone going to come in next to me with, 100 units to the acre? And that doesn't seem like a great transition. That doesn't seem like it's going to be supported by Plan 2040. So this is kind of the, this is the sort of the choke point of what you can do and where you can't do it.
This is a...
I'm going to sit here a second, so go ahead.
This is a significant bit of work here. This is where Land Development Code really supports and meets our comprehensive plan and what we say we want our community to be. It's a forcing function for that. Could I ask 2 questions, Elizabeth? The first one is, see, manufactured home park, and when I think about that, my first thought is mobile home. And in those parks, those densities are typically, I think, more than 6 or 12 per acre. They have the possibility for that. I also wonder, though, where in our code do we have provision for unconventional types of dwellings, tiny homes, things that might be very different from what we have today, but could enable very dense use of say somebody wanted to rework a mobile home and put 3 times as many tiny homes in there just to provide places for people to live. Does that exist someplace in this?
Yeah, hang on one second. I am putting a note on here just to remember this conversation. So there we go. Let's do that in white. Okay, so yeah, I was thinking about that same thing this morning. The maximum density for manufactured home park is fairly low. And so some of the things we're seeing on manufactured home parks. So first off, we're seeing manufactured home parks, which is a manufactured home that is built to the standards developed by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. HUD, it's called HUD certified. So that is a safe home for human habitation. It's the equivalent of building code, and it is not mobile homes. So this is often, people interchange one with the other, and totally makes sense because it could look the same, but a mobile home doesn't have that HUD certification. And so it hasn't met life safety standards. So we do say specifically in the code that is manufactured home park. It is a new zoning district, right? So this is something we're recommending. We've set it up like this so the layout is going to be more of a single family detached layout. We see it being used sometimes in some communities, and it's kind of building in frequency as affordable housing, right? So this is an opportunity to get to affordable housing for very low and low income persons. And so in some cases, we do adjust this and we say, okay, what zoning are you surrounded by, more or less? And those are your density requirements. So if you put a manufactured home park in what's going to be the R4 residential high density, then you could be looking at 16 to 32 units to the acre. So we could float it like that if the city thinks that that would be something they'd want to see. And then the other thing, the other way we do this is instead of making it its own zoning district, is we make it a use. And so we have a use with use specific standards, and we say you can do a manufactured home park in an R4 district. And so then you just need to meet the requirements of the R4 district and the manufactured home park, and you don't have to rezone to get there.
Okay.
I'm going to hold the tiny home question and see what you guys want to say about manufactured homes.
Yeah, if I.
Go ahead.
So I'm just looking at the densities and seeing that this is almost identical to the R3, and I'm wondering what is it that's inherent in the nature of manufactured homes that calls for a district or a zoning designation that is almost identical to but distinct from something else that's just right in the hierarchy here.
Yeah, so I think what you're seeing is just coincidence. And if you believe in coincidences, we didn't set it up that way. But our goal here in introducing it as a new district was to try to hit a sweet spot where it could find some acceptance. We know that, there's kind of a nationwide low T trauma over manufactured homes, and nobody wants them for reasons that have pretty much evaporated. There are some excellent looking manufactured homes out there now, and the price point is pretty reasonable. So we took this as start low, and make it so that it feels like it's coming in as a residential development. It can see some of the landscaping and the other amenities that are typically provided to a residential development, and it can be single family detached, which is appealing, across the board. No matter how much I bang the table on duplexes and triplexes, people want their own place with their own space. And so this is a way to get there, but we don't want to make it, the consultant team doesn't want to make it a flashpoint in this conversation. So we are more than willing to make changes to this based on what we think the city might see.
So go ahead.
No, I have a different question.
I was going to change subjects too. Go ahead.
Okay. Elizabeth, what have you done with the RSO and RMO? Are these in R districts now?
The RSO and RMO have moved into the mixed-use districts.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So my second question, go up to the top of your list. A scenario, you're RS7, you're on a half an acre lot, which is 20 some odd thousand square feet, just happened to be zoned RS7. There's neighborhoods, right, that we've been talking to that have this condition. What this says is, and I think what I heard you say is, this is a forcing function for meeting our comprehensive plan. fire burns the house down, whatever the cause is, the house is gone, they're going to rebuild. Are they then now required to have 2 dwelling units minimum per that half acre in that RS7 or the R2 zoned area?
Yeah, so in that case, because we put the minimum in, they would be required to do that.
So I guess the thing I would, what that suggests to me is then as we do this, the relation to current zoning into future zoning, given that the land use rights change quite a bit, if you've got neighborhoods that are, there's one, the Albemarle Neighborhood Associate, that whole area has lots that are zoned RS7, but were never really based on a 7,000 square foot lot. That's just the zoning that was there along with the golf course. I think that needs to be an intentional decision if we're going to change the layout of that whole area over through redevelopment over time. Either that or it needs to be an RS1. We need to look at that conversion from RS7 to R1 or R2 based on what's really there as opposed to maybe what had been there in the past.
Well,
That's what I'm trying to say.
And there are other neighborhoods with
Oh, bunches of them, yeah.
covenants that include single-family occupancy only.
Yeah. And HOA is another layer. Is that what you mean by,
No, I meant covenants,
okay.
not just the HOA requirement, but the covenants that have been maintained.
Sure.
Okay, so a couple things here. So this is a tricky one. We can do, sorry, let me pull this down here. At a minimum, we can say if your, hold on, that's not readable. We can say if your unit is destroyed, you can build back exactly as you were.
Yeah.
That is the simplest way to approach that. My concern with going down the road of, well, what about this neighborhood and what about that neighborhood is we will undermine the plan. The plan says we're increasing density, and we now are carving things out of increasing density. So I think we roll this back up into a question about, who are we increasing density for? Because the plan says it's across the city.
Yeah.
And we know there are some HOAs or covenants that are going to prohibit that, but is by changing the minimum densities, we will gut that. So is that where we want to be?
Yeah. I think that becomes maybe a fundamental question is, does does Lawrence want to provide for large lot, single-family homes that are not a part of trying to get at greater density? Do we want to have those types of neighborhoods in our community?
So I don't know the exact location of the Albemarle lots or the other lots that are in other people's heads.
Fall Creek is an example.
Rezoning to R1 is an option.
Yeah.
I guess I'm a little confused by the question because we have them. I mean, do we want more? Are you saying that as Lawrence grows, do we want to?
Do we want to provide for that? Yeah. Go ahead.
I think another way to look at the question is, do we want the new code to apply citywide, or are we just looking at new development? And leave the existing as it is?
Well, it's my impression that we are, so
New development,
it's only a
redevelopment.
matter of redevelopment that
Yeah.
that the density gets impacted, right? I mean, existing properties are not mandated to change their density.
Yeah, and if you built
It's
new.
only if you redevelop that you're required to observe the new density.
If you built new and you designed it there, then R1's there. It's only in redevelopment that the question, yeah, okay.
I think that-
Thank you for that.
Where you asked about a fire, well, you're still on the old zoning, but if you tore down your house at Albemarle, decided you were gonna bulldoze it and do something, then you'd be under the new rules. But a fire wouldn't change anything.
Right.
Yeah, we'll add, that language is not in there right now, but we will add it after this meeting.
Good catch. Okay. Thank you. Fire or tornado or whatever the thing is that tore your house down.
Yeah,
God forbid.
no kidding.
I have one quick comment. On the manufactured home park, as I believe I heard, that we don't want any stigma tied to that. Do we need the word park?
That's a good idea.
By simply including park in there, it absolutely makes you want to think about mobile homes.
And when I think manufactured home, I just automatically went to mobile home. I didn't
Oh.
think about a type of construction.
If you come out,
No, I mean, there are manufactured houses that are literally, they're
Oh, yeah.
drag and drop, and you put them on a site, and that's what I thought of.
And they look great. I mean,
yeah.
that's
They just did one out by us where they take the crane and lower it in
Yep.
and put them together, and they look great.
Yeah.
They are great homes.
looks like a house.
And particularly as we, I know Gary brought up,
And if I may, though,
tiny houses, there's now options from like places like Amazon and others where you can literally buy a house, have it drop shipped, you can drop a few walls, fold them up, and you have a house.
well, and that's why I'm wondering if we need a different zoning district specifically for that
Right.
kind of construction.
Right.
That's just not.
It's a
shouldn't be part of the
construction
construction
method.
Not the,
Yeah.
Yes.
not the
Yeah.
land use.
And I was conflating that with this idea of getting at creative new types of housing, which is totally not what,
I think I've.
Well, I'm trying to track Commissioner Carter, your question here. You're asking, should that be something in the building code versus in the land development
Yes.
code? I think the land development code will enable a much wider variety of building types. The building code will still be the building code. You're still going to need your fire separation, your minimum egress, your minimum room sizes, and that are still going to be in there. And I think that's just a universal standard you can apply. Now, it doesn't say you have to configure it in a certain way. Now, the difference between a manufactured house and a traditional built house is the code applicability that kicks in on that one. So that's the difference between, but that doesn't lie in the development code. That is really in the residential and the building codes themselves. So I think what you could do is if the conversation point is about tiny homes or whatever it happens to be, as long as the land use is enabled, the building code will take care of the parts that the building code needs to take care of. And that has minimum life safety standards and requirements in it.
Right, so I guess it's again, for those who are on the steering committee, you can spend hours talking about this. But I'm still a little bit puzzled why, I mean, let's go for somebody wants to develop a single lot, and they choose to do it with a manufactured home.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything under the current zoning, under the current building code that would prohibit something like that?
I'd have to meet the requirements. of
As
the
long as they
building
meet,
code.
as long as it, the safety and soundness standards are met,
it's governed by the building code.
as
Yep.
governed by the building code, is there anything in the zoning code that would prevent that?
The only thing that's we've run into previously, because we've had people ask and look at this, is the minimum lot size requirements that you have for the base zoning district. So you could do a tiny house on 5,000 square feet, but you still have 5,000 square foot lot with the parking requirements and the setbacks that would come with it. That's really been kind of the sticking point with it, but with some of the cottage style developments that you're starting to see that the new code predicts, or not predicts, but
It does.
it,
Also allows.
thank you. I was trying to, the word just went,
Coffee.
predict was not the word I was going for, but it's where it went to. But it kind of those different forms that we just didn't see in the old code, where I think is going to be a real change in how that wants to kind of flex and behave. And I think that's going to really change when you see those minimum and maximum density standards that are in there. Is, you get to a spot, you may have a good sized lot, but you may try to overload it in some ways, and you need some green space and you need some fire separation. Building code may come in and help with that, but there may be more that you want to do in excess of that are stream buffers or setbacks. And so that's where the land development code would come into that play. But I think what we're getting in this new code is those conversations about housing isn't kind of what we've always envisioned it to be sometimes. It has changed and evolved, and I think that's opening the door for a lot of those different options.
I want to ask a question in the middle of this conversation. I don't think we've hit head on. The code doesn't say clearly, and I've worked in other codes where we've said it directly, a single family unit can be a manufactured home. So instead of stick building my single family unit, I can put a manufactured home on my lot.
Then that would get back to David's question or comment earlier. Do we really need the
Yeah.
RMHP in there. And there, I would just say, there is some evidence that manufactured homes are built better than the stick ones that are built by construction companies. So it seems like the stigma is there by having that as a separate
I think I
zoning.
agree with you. And let's go back to Gary's question earlier. I think because the road that we're looking down is 3D printed homes. And, and the, all recircling all the way back to, Sears homes because it's coming in a box. Is this, something that we want to see in Lawrence and allow in Lawrence? Is this something that we definitely want to kick back to steering committee for a bigger conversation? And if we go down this path, are there minimum design standards that we want to make sure that the modular or manufactured units meet?
I would suggest bringing it back. I think not just our community, but our country as a whole are going to see increasing demand for creative housing types that don't fit the standard. And having whether it's in a new category or just how we provide for that, I think is an important thing for us to have ready so people can move there. And it needs to be in a way, because the people who are going to need this are going to be those least able to go through processes like this to do something different. We need to provision for that need.
And I just
My
wanted to add some background to this conversation too, because it's been a while since Elizabeth and her team have done a code assessment on our current code. But under our household living residential use group category, we have two, one just manufactured home and one manufactured home residential design. And so we have basically a manufactured home that doesn't have that residential design use standard component to it. That one has kind of limited zoning districts where it's permitted, but we do currently allow the manufactured home residential design in all of our single-family zoning districts, our RS zoning districts.
Thanks, Becky. I did completely forget that. Okay, so we're going to flag this for conversation with steering committee. I appreciate everyone digging in on that one. Anything else we want to talk about in terms of the changes and the density? I anticipate this will be a big subject of conversation as we move through adoption.
And then at some point, maybe not today, but at some point, just understanding, I'd send a message up to you on this, the process for as we overlay existing into the new, or overlay the new under the existing, however you think about it, that translation. I do think that there's still another conversation to be had about looking at what is real as opposed to what the current zoning category is, just to make sure that we're translating correctly. But
I appreciate you bringing that back up. So when we did the conversion map, we actually have conversion rules that we draft, so we do it consistently. So let me make sure we get those written down. And then if someone feels like we haven't applied the rules consistently to their property, that's a basis for a discussion.
yeah, it'd be great
One of the things that we want to talk about is how to kind of create a post-adoption window for people to come in and say, I don't think this completely caught my property accurately. Not to create a window for people to try to sneak in a rezoning, but to say, I was borderline between, two districts and you bumped me up. And I just think based on circumstances, bumping me down would be good. So usually when we're doing a change like this, we say, hey, property owners, we're going through the process. This is where we are. You've got 3 months or 6 months to come in and talk to staff, explain how you're reading the map and what you think the changes are. And Planning Commission and City Commission will take all of those up in a group on X date. So we let people know that they, haven't been changed by the process without being able to say anything about it. despite the fact that that map has probably been up for at least 6 or 8 months at this point in time.
Elizabeth, I have an unrelated question. I
Oh, good.
have unrelated questions.
Thank you. Please, take us someplace else.
I was recently at a neighborhood meeting,
Yeah.
and there were several neighborhoods represented there who said, we're just doing what we've always done. Those newer neighborhoods with covenants are essentially going to be excused from this. It's us older neighborhoods who are going to bear the brunt of it, who are going to have all the low-income people, and we have all the low-income people. They're just going to continue to be the same people we've always had. Nothing's going to change, except we're putting new dressing on it. And then when you take away parking requirements on top of it, it just makes it worse.
Yeah.
I think that's a significant concern. And one of the responses that was given to that is, don't worry, we're going to deal with each neighborhood in terms of its context. And I'm hearing you saying we've got to keep it uniform so that we don't undermine it. Somehow, all of that has to be brought into some coherent understanding of what we're doing or what we're proposing to do.
Okay, hang on 1 second. I just want to capture that. So, okay, so I want to start by really gently saying that let's not make any assumptions about people based on their income. Like, we've all started out somewhere without a lot, most likely. But what I think I hear you saying is that there might be properties that aren't maintained or that aren't well built or that somehow impact property values in the neighborhood. And those perhaps don't feel great or are not acceptable to the neighborhood. And the concern is that by making these changes, we're going to trigger a big round of redevelopment in order for people to put in more, and that will impact neighborhoods without HOAs or covenants. So I think that is a really valid question, and it's come up across the process. And some of what we see in other communities is that when property values get to the place where they are in Lawrence, it doesn't necessarily trigger that much redevelopment because it's too expensive. And you see more new development than anything else. But what I'd like to do is take this question back with staff and then to steering committee again, because I think you've been there for some of those meetings. I'm not entirely sure, but steering committee has wrestled with this one. And see what conversation we want to have about equitable changes. Not equitable in terms of the people, but equitable in terms of the impact or the inequitable impact on existing neighborhoods. Does that sound fair? Did I capture that okay?
You did, and I think it sounds not only fair, I think it sounds imperative. So
Okay.
thank you
Okay.
for doing that.
Yep.
Great observation.
I have a question. So I have a question, Elizabeth. So early on in the presentation, you said something about if there was a planned development, we are going to require developers to go above and beyond. Did I hear you say that correct? So
Yeah.
can you give me an example of what that would look like and what the planning commission's role would be to, look at an application? How do we, what is our responsibility going to be when something like that? Yeah.
Yep, okay, so we're gonna switch slides. Plan development. Okay. So the above and beyond needs to be either the development has enhanced sustainability, and so we put potential for that in the draft in terms of use or in terms of minimizing for vehicular transportation. So how are we impacting the kind of the world? So that is sustainability. It can distort structures. How you know that you're in the that will include historic structures. It can provide affordable housing Housing is defined in Lawrence, and we'll be pulling that definition into the code. Or the kind of the catch-all category is it can be providing a master plan to development that has a variety of development types in it. So it's more of a mixed use, or it's more of a mixed residential type. It's not going to be just the one sort of unit type. So those are the 4 we came up with. I will say, honestly, we haven't gotten a lot of comment on this section. And so if there's, anyone that wants to give it a look.
Income. And I can't remember all the numbers, but it was, you're an affordable housing unit if you are at, I think it was 30% of your monthly
Yes.
income. What if you get a raise? What if someone moves in that has more income? Does that mean that the dwelling is no longer an affordable dwelling unit because their income has changed? My point is that it seemed conditioned on the person living there as opposed to the cost of the unit relative to other things.
Relative to something in value.
Yeah, so it is, the standard is to base it on income. And the questions you ask are universally complex questions. But usually when people first qualify for an affordable unit, they do not get kicked to the curb the day after they get a raise. There is a process for determining, when it turns over and how that works. I think that I'm probably not the person to answer that question. I don't know if Becky and Jeff can, or if maybe this is a follow-on conversation with your housing staff.
Typically, what has happened is it's income qualification for entry to the unit. If you get a raise, it's not an automatically you have to move out situation in those instances, because you hope people get raises and you hope that works, and that's we all want that to happen. So what we hope to happen is you get those raises, you decide you need to change housing types, and you do it naturally through the market, and not so much of a you get booted out of the unit because of a raise or a situation like that. So the way it has typically been practiced is it's an income qualification for entry to the unit, and then some entities will have those requirements that it has to be maintained in a certain way. So if you have an income and you exceed it, then that may be for a different program provider, but not necessarily for us. And so that would be more about that as part of the conversation when we do. In your current code, you have for allowing a bonus dwelling unit if both units are for affordable housing. That is, we do that on the qualification side, and we leave it to the people running the program to determine what other program requirements that they would apply to that process.
And on this definition, if House X was subsidized with some funding, does that then qualify it to meet that definition? It's not just the dwelling unit itself being of a nature that its cost is low, but it could also be subsidized to be affordable housing.
It could be. It just depends on what program is running. So, like if you have I think of a great example of one real quickly. Tenants to homeowners would be one where they have the land. That's a different program than what you would see with Habitat for Humanity, which is a very different program from what you would see from Lawrence Douglas County Housing Authority. So it can range quite a bit on that one. What most of AHAB talks about is, you always talk about it in terms of land because it's kind of the supply side, those kind of things is you have to have a supply of units and a supply of land to do it. The other side of that, though, is the wages conversation, because it is a matter of, affordable housing is mainly a question of wages at some point too. And so we don't want to just, harm someone for getting a raise or working really hard to get a different job. But we do want to make sure that we do have units that are available and keep that going. So it is a bit of, you open the door for it with the land development code, and the programs would have other stipulations that may run along with it that would be a different point, kind of like what we were discussing with the building code.
I'm not trying to cause trouble. I'm just, but when I think about this being a definition of a physical thing, and that it is dependent upon all these other variables that are out there, we see projects come through that have an affordable housing component to it, but that that could go away just like that, or it could become 3 times as impactful in the direction that we might want it to go, based on things that have nothing to do with code or land use. I'm struggling with what to do with that.
No, in that case, so I think what we say in the PD section is it has to be permanently affordable housing. So that usually means it's affordable for 99 years. Somewhere in between 35 and 99, but more communities are moving to that 99. So I think what we need to do is bring back some additional information to answer these questions. I would suggest that, and I know that this stuff has been thought out, but just because it's been thought out, it's not in front of you guys. And this is an important sort of ancillary piece to this. So why don't we get the information back to you about how affordable housing works in Lawrence?
I just really want to make sure I understand it in the context of this code that's going to be indelible and long-lasting.
Yep. It says permanently affordable in the code. Yeah, go ahead.
Is the implication then that all affordable housing is by its nature rental? Because
No, not necessarily.
Because how do
You
you
can
control?
do permanently affordable housing that is for sale, and in which the owners are allowed to capture some of the equity. So this is part of how we move people into the chain of housing. And there are programs out there that do that, where typically the house is owned by a housing trust. It's sold, that owner sells it back, and they get to keep part of the equity, and then the trust sells it again. By then the market has probably gone up, so it can sell for a little bit more. But there are entities that do get people into home ownership in affordable housing.
And if we don't, as I understand it, our last housing survey was done in 2018. So I don't know how we can determine how much affordable housing we need if we don't have any idea how much we have.
Well, I think we start with the assumption that you need more at this point, and I think probably that there is, I think I understand that there's a new housing study, housing needs assessment coming up in the future. We don't specify a number in this code. That's done outside of the land development code.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Okay, so coming in on about 10 more minutes, I do want to show you guys a couple more slides. Is the sound okay at this point?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, yep. So just to let you know, you're going to see an updated use table fairly soon here. It's going to have all the funky colors and weird key taken out of it, so it's easier to read. It'll read just like we've been talking about. And so if you are curious or someone is asking you, what can I do on my lot, that's in the use table. We have some use-specific standards that have been primarily carried forward. Some of the new standards and definitions have been added. In the bottom box here are definitions for cottage industry, indoor and outdoor entertainment, drive-through facilities, and seasonal sales. So those were the things that were popping up as, hey, this isn't well-defined enough, or this is kind of a newer use that we want to do something with, or we want to think about differently. So as you're pondering this over the next couple weeks and you come up with anything that you think, this isn't well enough in the use table or the standards, just let us know. You can send an email to Becky or Jeff. So the other thing I wanted to touch on, and this ties back into our conversation today, you may remember we have the site and structure standards in here. And so this is bringing the community design manual into the code. And so same as the zoning districts in the what is not changing category, established development doesn't have to meet these standards unless they redevelop, right? Or they can scrape the lot and do something new, or they can redevelop on the site. I am wondering if, based on our conversation, we want to add a destruction exception to this also. So if you fire, tornado, whatever, you can rebuild as is or as was prior to the destruction. This is the other place where that exception might make a difference to a property owner. And then what is not changing, the code carries forward any area-specific design guidelines. So that includes the downtown area design guidelines, 8th and Penn, and the Oriad neighborhood design guidelines. If there are other existing adopted design guidelines that we need to know about and reference in here, let us know. So moving on, we've talked about mobility and connectivity, requiring in new development connections for existing and proposed modal systems. There's some jargon I'm going to get out of here. So how do we get pedestrians, bicyclists, and vehicles moving around? Excuse me. In the future, does that include e-bikes? Does it include scooters? You know, whatever is next. Does it include when we all get Jetsons, flying ships, or whatever they're going to be? But how do we effectively and safely move people around in development? Something I want to point out that we didn't talk about last time and that we have had a chance to go back and make some corrections to, or are working on some corrections to. The landscaping regulations, as we carried them forward, did have some provisions for xeric landscaping, but we're not as focused on native or naturalized landscaping, and we're making some adjustments to that. And across the board, we're thinking in terms of materials for water conservation. Big shift in parking and loading. Right now, as drafted, the code does not have minimum parking requirements. It has maximum parking requirements. This means for development that developers will be deciding how much parking gets provided. Lawrence is not alone doing this. I think we hit on this. Fayetteville is doing it. Austin just adopted it. There are a handful of other communities I can't think of off the top of my head who are going in this direction. A question that we get asked when we're talking about this shift from minimum to maximum is, do developers actually provide the parking? Yes, they do. They do it because it helps sell their product, but they also do it because the backup system here is banks, and they're requiring it for loans, for construction loans. So we're taking this burden off the city and taking it out of the requirements. In theory, someone could provide less parking because they have a population that doesn't require parking, or because they're in a place where people really have access to walking and transit, and they can do that. On the whole, it's probably not going to change the parking landscape for now. It may change it down the road, and it may open up some redevelopment opportunities in some of the city's strip malls or lifestyle centers.
Hey, Elizabeth,
So,
how do communities address the potential that if commercial parking requirements are reduced, that it could unintentionally push parking load into the adjoining neighborhoods?
Yeah, so that problem is better solved outside of the zoning code through a parking management system. So that could be like neighborhood stickers or hang tags, or on-street signs that, require parking to turn over. It's more efficient to do that through a day-to-day living system than to require the parking on the site, which is taking up other development opportunities and, for the most part, still fairly overworked.
Got it. Thank you.
And the city is studying the neighborhood sticker system.
And Elizabeth, this may be your next slide, but when you talk about loading and access, I know in past meetings we've talked about the importance of spaces for ride share and door-to-door delivery. So like your Amazon trucks and stuff like that.
I'm glad you brought that back up because it hasn't made it in yet. Let me get it there.
Awesome, thank you, appreciate it.
Yeah,
It's
thank
my
you,
last
thank you, thank
meeting,
you.
so I've got to.
Thank you.
And we have 5 minutes, Elizabeth, so yeah, just FYI.
Anybody else? I'm almost done, actually. I wanted to get you guys to the big stuff that you'll probably be hearing about. Let me see. Ride share, drop off,
Delivery.
automated delivery. Some of this is curb management. That's a new term. And some of it is just how do we deal with what we got going on here. Okay. Thank you for bringing that back up. Let me see if there's anything else big that we want to talk about. Nope. So let's go to the key topics. Just reminding everybody that we have made multiple changes across the code to address the need for affordable housing. And you've seen all of this, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it. To address sustainability issues of conserving sensitive areas, thinking about how we move people around from more compact development, and how we are thinking about water conservation and food production. And then this was our discussion last time. I think I missed a slide. No. So our next steps are the consultant team and staff are working together pretty much daily at this point and edited, so we can post a draft at the end of May, which has the 90-95% of the edits in it. We anticipate more edits will come up through the adoption process. It usually works out that way. I believe, and I'm going to look at you, Becky, we will be doing an introduction meeting with Planning Commission in late May. Yeah, May 29th, was that when that was?
Yes.
Okay. And so I think what we'll do is revise this PowerPoint down to a very few slides to give an overview of what's changed and what's stayed the same. We will also be bringing that information to our outreach meetings next week. So the message that's going to start going out is, here's the code. It's in complete format. We are still editing it. But if you're just looking for the highlights, here they are. We have a series of 6 public outreach meetings, a couple developer group meetings, and spaces to do some neighborhood meetings over 4 days next week. And we'll come back from that and collect those edits and decide what to recommend for code changes. And then we'll let the public start talking with you about it, and we'll move into more of a support role in answering questions and finding information as it goes through adoption.
Thank you.
Did I capture everything there?
Perfect.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
So Becky, this month's meeting is just an introduction. It's not a vote. Or
Right. The Planning Commission will be receiving it, and there'll be an opportunity for public comment.
public comment. Okay. But it's just introduction.
Correct.
Okay.
Right. And then presumably the next meeting, then there be receiving, there would be another meeting in the future where then
Right.
there'd be an opportunity to make a recommendation.
And we have copies of these slides.
Yes, Elizabeth?
Yeah. I'll email them to Becky and Jeff, and you can distribute them out. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great job, Elizabeth.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, guys. Great input. I have more work to do. Thank you for that. Have a great day.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Meeting adjourned. Thank you.
She's just great.
Thanks, Prashant.
Thank you.
Like a well-oiled ride.